One of the most exciting fights of all time just happened to be the fight that would save the UFC and turn it into the MMA promotion we know of today. Before the Griffin vs. Bonner fight, the UFC was basically just an underground fight promotion about to die. But right after the fight had went down, overnight the UFC became a mainstream sports league in the making. The UFC president Dana White even said, without this fight, the UFC wouldn't exist today. To understand why this fight mattered so much, we need to go back. The UFC started in 1993 as a wild experiment, the ultimate proving ground to see which martial art was truly the best. No gloves, barely any rules, no weight classes, and no real rounds, just raw fighting. The UFC saw success in their first couple events, with UFC 1 to 5 seeing massive success, gaining a ton of attention and sales through its shock value promotion. The main selling point of the UFC at the time was its brutality. The fact that it was a fight with no rules, two fighters could do whatever they wanted with each other until the fight got stopped. But while the concept was shocking and brutal enough to grab attention, it also made politicians furious. John McCain famously called it human cockfighting. And just like that, the UFC found itself banned in multiple states, thrown off pay-per-view, and dismissed as an unserious blood sport. So past UFC 5 and onwards, the attention the UFC had gotten saw a sudden decline. The shock value that gave them attention in the first place had now faded. For years, the UFC barely held on. Fans existed, but they were underground, niche, loyal to something the mainstream wanted nothing to do with. Then, in 2001, everything changed. Zuffa, led by casino magnates Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta with their friend Dana White as the president, bought the UFC for just $2 million. And from day one, they had a vision: to legitimize the sport. At the time, the MMA promotion Pride became the real deal before the UFC had become the king of MMA. Pride was the first MMA organization to legitimize the sport, adding more structure and professionalism rather than making the entire event feel like an underground brawling event. So the UFC took after Pride, and they introduced weight classes, brought referees in the cage, gave the fighters gloves, rounds, and rules to give structure to this chaos. Slowly, MMA began to actually look like a real sport. But this progress came at a cost. From 2001 to 2004, the UFC was losing money. Tens of millions of dollars was lost. The pay-per-view buys were very low, barely clearing 50,000 buys, and live events drew small crowds, which was obviously not enough to sustain the company. And sponsors were still not interested in investing into the sport, given its bad reputation, which was still there even after the UFC tried to become more structured and professional. The idea that they would become the new king of martial arts was starting to fade. Weird enough, Pride was seeing huge success at the time, becoming mainstream in Asia, and started actually producing stars of the sport, like Fedor Shogun, Cro Cop, and Wanderlei Silva, which became huge assets that the UFC did not have. The biggest stars from the UFC was only Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz, which were at the time no global stars like the guys from Pride. So, by 2004, Zuffa was staring down disaster. Dana White has admitted they were just weeks away from pulling the plug with around $40 million down to just keep the lights on for the UFC. By the mid-2000s, things weren't looking good. MMA was still a very, very niche sport. Hardcore fans were loyal, but to most people, boxing was still the dominant king of combat sports. MMA was still illegal in big markets like New York, which meant no Madison Square Garden and no mainstream headlines. And the production? Let's just say it was a far cry from the glitzy, pyrotechnic UFC events we know today. The UFC wasn't dead yet, but it was definitely on life support. They needed anything to work, so they could actually turn this underground sport into something people would actually watch. That's when Zuffa went all in on one final gamble: The Ultimate Fighter. A reality TV show where up-and-coming fighters lived in a house together, trained, and fought for a UFC contract. 16 fighters lived in a house with no outside contact, and they trained with coaches Randy Couture and Chuck Liddell. They fought in weekly elimination bouts, with the finale of fights being aired live. But here's the catch: no network wanted it. Networks saw the UFC as too violent and too niche. Everybody knew it was a huge risk. Zuffa tried to make a deal with Spike TV, which would be the perfect network to host their reality show because of their demographic of young adult males. But Spike TV didn't want to buy the show, as they too saw this as a huge risk. Zuffa had to pay Spike $10 million just to air season 1. That's right, they were basically buying their own commercial. It was a massive risk. If the show flopped, the UFC was finished with millions of dollars down the drain. But if it worked, it could change everything and become one of the biggest combat sports of all time. And that all came down to the finale. April 9th, 2005, the finale of Season 1, Forrest Griffin versus Stephan Bonnar. The stakes couldn't have been higher. For the fighters, it was a chance at a UFC contract and a career. For the UFC, it was survival. If they pull this off, maybe the vision that the Fertitta brothers and Dana White had in 2001 could finally come true. The first round starts slowly, but as the round goes on, the pace goes up, and the fighters start beating each other up. Neither man was backing down. Bonnar rocks Forrest, and he rocks him right back, and they both manage to catch each other many times over, and they even get to the ground in the last minute, showing that both men were going for a finish. The second round starts, and Bonnar rocks Griffin once again, but then gets taken down and gets put under pressure with brutal shots on the ground. When the fighters eventually return to their feet, both guys were very hurt, but they still keep pushing the pace and take turns beating each other up with blood now all over their faces. Combat sports had never seen something like this before, two guys going at it like their life depended on it. By the final round, the fighters were still pushing the pace and knew it was time to empty the gas tank. You could see that the fighters were very equally skilled as they were trading their punches and leaving it all on the table. And as the round went on, something incredible happened. Ratings spiked. Fans were literally calling their friends saying, "Turn this on right now. Two guys are beating the crap out each other." And by the third and final round, the fight had peaked with 3 million live viewers, which was a record-breaking viewership for the UFC. As the fight ended, Forrest Griffin won the fight by a 29-28 unanimous decision, but due to the quality of the fight, both fighters were rewarded with UFC contracts. The fight cemented itself as the fight that changed the UFC forever and saved them from bankruptcy. But how did the UFC really change? When the UFC had its moment, Griffin versus Bonnar wasn't just a great fight, it was a cultural spark. Griffin versus Bonnar was the fight that brought all the eyes to the sport that the UFC needed at this time. Spike immediately signed a multi-year deal with the UFC. More Ultimate Fighter seasons followed, along with live fight nights. Pay-per-view sales started exploding after 2006, and the UFC even managed to get bigger than Pride after they had faced their decline around the same time. So by 2007, the UFC bought Pride's assets, absorbing many of its top fighters like Shogun, Rampage, Cro Cop, and Wanderlei Silva. And the first big stars from the UFC was also born from this, like the household names Chuck Liddell, George St. Pierre, and Anderson Silva. MMA was no longer a fringe experiment, it was now a booming sport about to take over. 10 years later, in 2016, the UFC sold for $4 billion, the largest sale in sports history at the time. And that one fight, it's still remembered as the fight that saved the UFC.